We're going to start seeing like a lot of traditional coders move into no code, but we're also going to see a lot of no code platforms going through some serious changes to be able to really cope with the demands of more established engineering organizations. Right?
What's up, everyone? Welcome back to This Week in No Code. I'm your host, JJ Englert, here with my co-host, David Pal. David, where in the world are you this week?
I am in Christchurch, New Zealand.
Fantastic. We have another fantastic episode for you this week. We have a full slate of news, and then we're also bringing on one of the co-founders of Toddle, one of the new and upcoming front-end frameworks and platforms in the no-code industry. But before we get into that, David, why don't you take us away into the no-code news of this week?
Let's get started this morning with, or afternoon, depending on where you are. It's the next day over here in New Zealand with the Product Hunt Golden Kitty Award. At the end of last year, I'm sure you saw some of your favorite makers and creators posting on Twitter, asking for your votes. And we got a big slate of really interesting products that won. Lots of the winners this year were AI driven, somehow related to AI. Of course, as expected, OpenAI takes the cake with GPT-4. Right? Yep. That was the product of the year, followed shortly by ArcMax, the browser, and Notion AI. Right? Mm-hmm. Being able to integrate AI into Notion.
Yeah, I love Notion AI. I use it all the time now, and it's super fun. But you could almost call it like the year of AI, 2023, in this sense.
Yeah, I think so. It seems like everything is something AI, right? All of these winners. In the no-code world, Bento was the winner for all of the no-code tools.
And it's
Bento
like a
is
link and bio builder.
Yeah, a link and bio builder. Ply, the beta version of Ply, which I haven't used. Maybe we should look into them sometime for the pod. They are an internal app tool, also built with no code. And then Dora AI, which is a prompt-centered website builder. So these are no-code tools. Again, most of them have AI somewhere in there.
Yeah, but, I've used Bento. I gave that a run. It's a beautiful looking link and bio builder, but like it's a link and bio builder. It's not like revolutionary, kind of thing. So I was a little underwhelmed in this category. It felt almost like a popularity contest in that sense. But I feel like some of these other awards, they hit it on the spot. I really like Pika. The Notion AI, that's probably a popularity thing as well, but I really love that as well. So generally, I think I'm glad to see that we have an authority in this industry doing these kind of things, right? I've also tried to do it in the own community, no code awards kind of thing, but I think generally this is just a good thing to have for this industry. And I think it was well done and well celebrated across the field. I think one last thing is the maker of the year, right? And that's Mark Liu for launching 14 diverse products. This dude is shipping fast. And of course, I think the biggest one that he's just making a ton of money on right now is it's called Ship Fast, isn't it? Something like that. It's just, it's a template for like React, I think, developers to get up and running really quickly. The essence of it is it's pre-built components in a code base that essentially it's kind of like what no code is doing, but it's for developers. And so it's like the whole underlining thing here is everyone wants to move faster. They just want to keep the power of moving fast along the way. Right. And so like whether you're in code or no code, still time is of the essence and everyone wants the solution that gives you the most power and most customization along the way. So I thought that was interesting. Why don't we get into actually Notion's calendar? So this also came out about a week or two ago. I'm not going to get in too deep on this. I've given it a try. I've been using it as a calendar the last 2 weeks. It's a calendar, right? There's nothing too special about it. They recently acquired Cron in 2022. They kind of rebranded.
Which was a surprise.
Yeah.
People were surprised to see that happen.
Yeah. And so, the whole idea for me is I like that when working in Notion, I can use like real-time availability in Notion now as like a data source because the two are connected. So I really like that, but I actually haven't found a use case for that yet. So not worth actually switching your calendar if like this is your thing, unless you're a heavy power Notion user and you need some kind of real-time availability within Notion. then maybe it makes sense. But for me, I'm just probably going to go away from it and just stick with a simple calendar on my side.
Yeah, it's interesting. I read someone's tweet a couple of weeks ago, and it was something like, the guy who drinks one coffee wants to try all the fancy coffees. A guy who's had 1,000 coffees goes, just give me a coffee. And the same thing kind of feels with a lot of these productivity tools. Eventually, you're just like, I just want it simple, right? And
Yeah.
it turns out that it's not the flashy, pretty one. It's the simple one that actually might just be like a notepad, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's not the super complicated bells and whistles, has everything packed in, you can do everything. It's just the easiest.
Yeah. I think one
yeah.
feature that I liked about it is it makes it a little bit easier to like send availability to someone to like book a meeting. Like that was like, okay, that maybe I don't need to use Calendly for it because I can use this. But honestly, I haven't really figured out how to use that feature well. It's a little complicated. And so that's not the easiest in its
Yeah.
sense. So
Yeah. And now Google Calendar has it. You can
Yep,
just send
Google
it through
Calendar
Google
has it.
Calendar. So it's
Yep.
like, why we don't need another thing to integrate. And it doesn't even integrate with everything, right? Like
Yeah.
it doesn't work with Outlook. So maybe your customers can make it work.
Yeah. How about A16Z? What do we got on that
Andreas
side, David?
Horowitz published a report, American Dynamism 50 AI edition. Basically, how are their portfolio companies contributing to very large problems, right? This is supposed to be a showcase of, what we as creators in the country can do. And these problems are very big, very hairy problems. Everything from aerospace, defense, energy, transportation, and manufacturing. How are these companies using AI? They cover a bunch of these companies. It's a really interesting report. It's some really interesting companies. Some you might know, like the Boring Company, which is Elon's company. I love the name. I just think it's so tongue in cheek. They are a boring company because they are boring holes in the ground for tunnel. They have projects like Las Vegas Loop, which sounds cool.
I think they
Not
shut that down. Hyperloop, I think they shut.
Hyperloop shut down, but
Yeah.
the Las Vegas Loop,
Oh,
I
okay.
think it's like a tunnel of Teslas to drive you through Las Vegas.
Gotcha.
It's cool. I think it's a good concept. I think most of their projects actually aren't working out. Like they haven't really delivered too many final projects, but it's a cool way to think about problems.
Gotcha.
The other one, actually one of the first on the list, if you open up the PDF they have, is Aerodome, which is basically if you call 911, they will send a personal drone to fly over the crime scene. And if you haven't seen this demo on Twitter, go check it out. The CEO posted this absolutely insane demo. It looks so cool.
Yeah.
I think it's really cool. There's another company similar to this that's actually doing video chat with 911 dispatchers.
Yeah.
Basically, the idea is like, you don't want to wait for an emergency responder to get to the scene to know what's going on and then call for more reinforcements. You want to be able to send them what's happening.
Yeah.
Immediately, give you feedback if you need to go do something faster than they can get there. But the drones, right, like as the crow flies, is always much faster, especially in Los Angeles.
I want to add on to that one. There's this other company that's doing it in more third world countries where they're doing it with prescription drugs. And so they work with hospitals and they can get very like important prescription drugs and or kidneys and heart transplants to things in places that don't have access to that, but they can get it in like exceptional speed and also at a more like they can't afford, like third world countries can't afford like a real helicopter. So they're doing it at more affordability too. And so I think we're going to continue to see huge drone services and additional things pop up as drones just continue to be more realistic of faster transportation, more affordable robots. Like, you don't need actual drivers in that sense. So it's an interesting world where we're getting into with drone technology.
Yeah. One business idea that I thought would be kind of interesting. I came from the billboard world, was actually installing drone charging stations in the billboards, right? Like billboards are like a V, right?
Yeah.
Like a V. There's one side and the other side. In the middle, you'd build a platform because they all have power, right? Because of the lights or it's digital billboard, right? They all have power.
You're
And you
5
would
years
just
ahead
build
of
a
your time.
platform and just drop the drone would sit there and charge and then move
Yep.
on to whatever it needs
Yep.
next.
You're
So
5 years ahead of your
all these
time.
little states.
I
Yeah,
actually
so
want to add on to this. I'm going to go off script a little bit. I was recently listening to Reid Hoffman, and he had a meeting with President Biden. And I'm not trying to get political in any sense here, but I actually thought that his take on his meeting with President Biden, and it was reflecting on AI and how President Biden can prepare the US for AI going forward. And Reid's take on it was actually quite good. You don't see much good news about Biden, or, generally you just see like the sleepy news, but he was like, generally Biden was very aware and alert and had a really good approach to this. He didn't claim to be an expert in any one way. He more structured the conversation around how is this going to impact the middle class? And I have these people working on these solutions and initiatives. Is that the right approach? Am I missing anything? And what should I really know about, what's to come kind of thing? And had that kind of conversation with Reid Hoffman and a couple other business leaders. And
interesting.
Reid actually left the conversation feeling quite optimistic about the strategy going forward and how he had a good approach of just not knowing the answers, but trying to talk to as many experts as possible to create the teams to go out and figure these answers out in a proactive way,
Yeah.
which I thought was actually a healthy kind of approach to this kind of thing.
Yeah, I think we're not going to know what the answer is. And it's actually a good segue into the next piece of topic. The next topic on the news today is the new future of work. In that report, actually, one of their takeaways is we are not at the mercy of AI to see how it's going to change our world. We can still decide how we want AI to change our world and change our work and change our lives, right? It's not just a predetermined outcome that we're just waiting for it to unfold. We have, some authority into what this is. So, the president and Reid Hoffman thinking about what policies, what technologies, what are we going to really impart into the country that will allow this to be the real world of AI and how we want it to change is actually a little bit better than just like hoping for the next chat GP, whatever number, GPT 17 to come out and solve all of our problems. Like we still have work to do to put this into place and make it work. But do you want to talk a little bit more about this future of work?
Yeah, so Microsoft's new Future of Work Report 2023 provides comprehensive insights into integration of large language models, LLMs, into various work practices. So examining the impact on productivity, critical thinking, creativity, collaboration. It covers a wide range of topics, including the benefits and challenges of human AI collaboration and the application of LLMs in complex and creative tasks. And
LLMs.
LLMs. So generally, people took 30% less time on common writing tasks, they're finding. Some other consultants produced 40% higher quality on simulated consulting projects. Users were also experiencing 2x faster at solving simulated decision-making problems when using LLMs based on search over traditional search. So generally, more productive outcomes, quicker outcomes, even higher quality outcomes they're seeing in this new report from Microsoft for the future of work.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. There's some interesting, I guess, counter positions in this article. On one hand, the article says the people that benefit the most are actually novices, right? The people who do the best at these writing tasks or most tasks are people who are just not familiar with the materials.
Gotcha.
But the most people who are actually using AI and LLMs in their day to day follow the same, they call it the digital divide, usually not underrepresented groups. And usually it's the college educated folks that are using these AI tools on a day-to-day basis. And so I don't know what to read into this. They're not making claims about the future and what this is, but they're saying the novices are getting the most value, but that may not be the same people who are using it. Kind of what they were getting at. It'll be interesting to see how inequality in tech changes, better or worse, or I don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah. It's funny. I think generally we live in a bubble, like you and I, Twitter universe, like we're in a bubble, like for example, Last night, I taught Zapier to 100 local professionals. They all have jobs. They're working professionally, right? Even Zapier and the automations it provides was like, whoa, right? And so, like,
Yeah.
that was already a big step forward for them and how they could use this in their workplace and everything. And that was a big thing. And then I showed them AI, like, essentially, like, they were seeing it for the first time. And then they were like, whoa, 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 right? But like, AI is like two
Whoa,
steps,
whoa,
three steps
whoa.
down the line of like where they are kind of currently, which is Zapier, right? And
Right.
and those
Which
very
we used
basic
a decade
tools.
ago.
Exactly, right? And
Yeah.
so we're on the front lines here. I think we're going to continue to see crazy trajectory, but like massive adoption is still years behind. I think Sam from OpenAI, Sam Altman, the other day he had an interview and he was essentially like, "Listen, when we release AGI, the world's going to freak out for like 2 weeks, and then it's just going to go on to like living like the normal thing. Like we're going to have this huge reaction of like, oh my god, all this can happen now, but then like everything's going to go back to normal and just be quiet, and then eventually say it's not fast enough or whatever, right? Like on the
Mhm.
front lines here, we're
Yeah.
easy to react quickly. We want the latest and greatest, but remembering that still the masses, the general public, is still like years behind that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it will probably unfold that way, depending on how fast AGI happens. It could, I mean, we'll see how it goes, of course. I'm hopeful that that's how it happens. And it's not such a big, explosion of the top 0.01% of people somehow harnessing AGI in a way that, makes a lot of other people uncomfortable or out of work or any of these things.
Yeah.
But I think even at AGI level, it's still not full grown adult AGI in the beginning, right? Like there are levels, just like chatbots, there were levels, and we'll see how it keeps growing.
Yeah. So here we are with one of the co-founders of Toddle, a front-end no-code platform, Andreas. Andreas, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Absolutely. And thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. Tell
Absolutely.
us a little bit about yourself. How did you come to creating such a platform?
Yeah, so I've been a web developer for, well, over 20 years now. Started as a sort of individual contributor, as we call it,
Yeah.
building web apps. A little bit of front end, back end, full stack, depending on the job. I've been worked in everything from startups, scale ups to large enterprises. And more recently, also as a manager and even a manager of managers in a sort of a scale up, which was the last company I was in before Toddle. And Toddle was sort of a project that for a long time lived rent free in my mind. I kept having this feeling of like, why is this designer shipping me like what's almost a finished layout? And now I have to go and build it from scratch in code. It just felt very unnecessary
Yeah.
all the time. So that's kind of the sort of the nagging feeling that led me to go and figure out how can I actually make a tool that would solve this and how can I actually, and which eventually became Toddle.
And what year was that? When did you get started? What was like the first line of code?
Oh,
When
I
was that
just
written?
had a look at this the other day because there was some iterations on this, and there was a lot of versions that sort of either hit or slightly missed the waste paper basket. But I think the start was 2019. Late 2019 was some of the first drafts on how this should work.
Cool.
It seems like most of the people starting these no-code platforms, front ends, back end, are engineers that have just felt the pain for many years, and they're like, "Why am I rebuilding this every single time?" Am I on point there? What do you feel?
Yeah, I think that's probably pretty spot on. I would also say it's like building a no code platform like Toddle and like all of these platforms is some of the most complicated software I've ever built, right? So if you haven't built software for a long time, it's quite a task. So I think it'll naturally be engineers because I think it takes a long time to get to a point where you can build stuff at that complexity, whether it's code or no code, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that are the same whether you're coding or building in a no code tool.
Yeah.
And you've made it a little extra hard by kind of like abstracting and building on top of itself, right? So Toddle is built with Toddle, right?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if that makes it extra hard or extra easy, depending on your take, right?
There you go.
I can tell you for sure that in the early days, it definitely made it extra hard because if you're building your tooling yourself, that means if you introduce a bug, you also broke the tool you're going to use to fix it.
Right.
So there was some real facepalm moments in the early days.
Yeah.
But I think at this point, it's very, very clear to us and the whole team that is a massive benefit, right? I've been coding for, like, as I said, well over 20 years, and I'm much faster on Toddle than I am writing code. And so is everyone else in the team, and especially people who are not like long-time coders, right?
Yeah.
So we're seeing enormous benefits from building in a no-code tool, as I'm sure you're very aware of.
Yeah.
So at this
That's why
point,
we love
it's not
NoCode.
harder. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of foot guns in that. There's a lot of like
a bit of
cases where you're
activation
going into
energy.
Yeah,
Once
sure.
you get over the hump of it working, then makes more sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so when someone says what tech stack is your code built on, what do you tell them?
Well, so there's obviously many different parts to Toddle. There's the front end, the editor, right, that you're actually loading in your browser, and that is 100% built in Toddle. So that whole thing is a Toddle application. Toddle applications are its own sort of proprietary language / framework. It's kind of a combination of the two. That's not built on any existing technology. Like the actual runtime part is written in TypeScript, but other than that, we're not really using any libraries or frameworks. And the main reason is really that they're all kind of focused on code. So being able to cut away the code part and still get the rest of it out is usually not that easy. It actually tends to be a little bit brittle as these frameworks evolve. So we decided to sort of start from scratch and saying we're gonna build our own, because it needs to be tailor-made for our specific solution.
Interesting.
And when people ask you what Toddle is, what is your response?
Yeah, what's the tagline, I guess?
Well, the tagline, I can't actually remember the latest one we have on our website. So, but you can always go and look that up. But I say it's a platform for building web applications without the need to write code. And that's sort of the most directly and maybe the least marketing version of the tagline. But that's sort of the essence of it, right? And it's really about making it easier to ship projects, like front-end projects,
right,
and fast and efficient, right?
So tell us about the front end. Is it using like a JavaScript framework in that sense? Are you exposing divs and you can, adjust, things like that? What level of control do you have in the editor?
So as I say, it's not based on any existing framework. We build it from scratch, and again, the main reason is there wasn't a particularly good fit for a framework that didn't either require us to do some extra work to make it fit, and also then came with a lot of extra stuff we don't really need, right? Yeah. So we want to make sure performance is the best we can do. We want to keep it very light, and that means not shipping like a whole framework if we don't have to do that.
Gotcha. That also means that you can't export it then, correct?
Well, at least not to an existing framework. No, that's true. Like that, I mean, it's not necessarily true. You could probably build that. It's not something we have on our roadmap or any plan to do. Yeah. But I mean, you can access the underlying data structures of how your app is built, and it would be possible to go and build a compiler that export that to any framework. Really.
Cool.
But no, it's not something we have built in today.
Cool. And what is the size of your team, and where are you guys at in your journey of this?
Yeah, so we are 5 people now in total. It started out just being me in the really early days, and then my co-founder, Casper, who's a designer, joined. And he kind of saw the same problem I did. I was tired of always having to rebuild stuff designers did, and he was tired of doing a design and then having a coder come and completely destroy it and come back and say, should it look like this? And he goes, no, it should not look anything like that. Can you try again, please? And then we go into that cycle, right? That's not even remotely what I designed. And so we both felt the same problem from different angles. So he was incredibly hooked right away and say, I just want to do it myself. That's perfect. If I can do that, that would be wonderful. And then in November 2022, we raised our first round of funding and could hire a couple more people that joined in early 2023. And because this has sort of been my own project, working to get something working mostly to validate it for me. There were some rough edges that needs to smoothing out. So we launched our public beta in May
Of
uh,
2023?
of 2023, and wasn't actually planning on monetizing early because we expected people would want some time to just play around and build hobby projects and stuff, because I wasn't quite familiar with the no-code community yet, or not as much as I thought. And it turns out it's a very different mindset. It's more like, yeah, let's build a business on this, see if it works.
I just ship the
So I
damn
come
thing.
from,
Yeah.
I mean, I come from a world where we're really proud of ourselves if we've shipped two big features in a month, right? And we'll pat ourselves on the back and we'll go and celebrate. And I'm coming into this world where people are like, oh, I actually started 2 businesses this month from scratch. Like that's
4
sort of a different
LLCs.
mentality.
Yeah. I got 18
And
domains.
we kind of had to adjust
That's
to
so
that a little
true.
bit. It is
Yeah.
very true.
It-
Like, to
I-
be fair, they don't all survive, but that's kind of the point,
Sure.
isn't it? Yeah.
I early on, as soon as I learned the power of no code, I quickly spun up a lot of businesses. And it was just because like I could. Like I was sitting on my couch and over the weekend I was like, here's another business, right? And I quickly learned that like you just can't do that. Like you need to actually go and market these businesses and operate them, and that's not how it works, right? But having that freedom and that ability is really liberating. And I was previously a non-technical founder, learned how to build for the first time in no code, and then I was spinning up my own businesses and I was just hooked. But that's totally in the mindset. You got that pretty right. Yeah.
But I mean, obviously, it's not long-term sustainable to spin up multiple businesses every month. But there's some real value in saying like, let's throw 3 at the wall and see which one sticks, and then we'll invest in that one.
Yeah.
And
I
I
think
kinda
it's
love
just
that
the
mindset.
ability to be able to do that is also the value of that as well.
Yeah, for sure, right? That's like the 0 to working application. You can't beat that in no code. And I think that's sort of an area where there's a lot of tools that are especially good at that. Like something like Software and Glide Apps are 2 that I'm quite impressed with, like just how quickly you can get from 0 to MVP
Yeah. It's
or
literally like
prototype,
minutes
right?
these days.
Yeah,
You know?
and I mean, that's not a viable business, but it might be enough it's often enough to validate, right?
Yeah, or
And
it just
that's
different use
really impressive.
cases, like those are meant for internal tooling and just, simple directories and portals and intranets and all that kind of thing. Whereas you don't need that full complexity. Whereas, maybe a different use case could call for that.
Andreas, when you were getting started, you said something changed when you kind of dove in headfirst into the no-code community. Who were you building for at first? Who did you think the
Well,
user was
initially, I was building just for myself. I just wanted to solve my own problems, right?
So
Toddle was really never about building a tool for people who didn't know how to code. That was never really the original goal. And that's sort of added on later. And it still really isn't the primary goal of the project. It just happens to work out really well that way. The real goal is to say, whether you can code or not, what is the most effective way we can help you build applications, and ideally the kind of applications that can scale and you can actually build a whole business around. So the world I came from was mostly like larger scale SaaS applications, and sometimes in the like sort of millions to hundred of million of dollars of revenue running through these systems, right? And where we have teams of anything from 5 to 20 or 50 developers working on the same application, right? And so that was sort of that's sort of the world I came from, saying like, I want to see, can we do something that works here? And as I explored it, it was actually originally intended to be a low-code app, and I was like, we'll just put in code for all the logic bits and just do the UI, right? And I kept sort of getting annoyed every time I had to switch to code and going like, well, this little thing would actually, we can build a better interface for doing like APIs, right? I don't want to write fetch code. I can build something better for APIs. And then you kind of, well, I just need to take this one property and put that into my UI. I can do something smarter for that. And sort of eventually I got to a point where like, okay, I've shot all these holes in my code setup. Really, there's not that much left. So let's take the last jump and figure out, how does it work if we completely switch over and there is no code as part of your developer journey? And it turned out, for me, even though I've coded for a while, that was a lot faster, right? So that sort of became, well, obviously that's where we're going. And now that you don't need to code, we also basically cut 2 years off your developer journey. Like the first 2 years, you don't really have to do those now.
Yeah.
So that's a massive win on top.
there's still a lot of critics out there, and I'm not going to stereotype you too much here, but critics like you, coming from 20 years of software, 10 years of software, they say, oh, no code can't scale, no code is not powerful, and they just immediately dismiss it, right? I'm like, what? How do we tell these people, like, no, just give it a chance? What do you say?
Well, I mean, that was very much me, though, right? I mean, I
I
fit
know, that's
perfectly
why
into
I'm
that
asking. I want
category.
to know, how do we do this?
And I think there are two parts to that answer. One of them is that I think a lot of developers are like looking at what they do on a daily basis and some of the complexity they're working with, and seeing the idea that someone could do this or build something like this in half the time with a fraction of the experience. They find that ridiculous, and that kind of makes sense. And the
Sure.
reality is that there are just cases where you can. And I think there's a history, because I mean, when we go out and tell people about Toddle, it's not like we're saying, look, we came up with a brand new idea, because it's a really old idea. Like the oldest no code or visual development tool we found is 1963, which is like 20 years before people, it was normal to even have monitors for computers.
Wow.
Someone was playing around with like, how do you use a light pen to draw like diagrams and actually do logic that way? Like really, like it's there's nothing new
Pioneers,
about the
man.
idea of doing it, right?
Jeez.
Yeah.
I want to go
But
in and just shake that person's hand and be like, dude, you are 60 years ahead of your time, bro.
yeah, unfortunately, that is no longer possible. But yeah, his name is Ivan Sutherland, and he made an app called Sketchpad
Okay.
way back. But and if you look at the history, we've seen applications like this and languages. Like there are a lot of what we normally call visual programming languages, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of them when you start searching, and none of them really became that popular, right? We've just, and I think a lot of developers have just seen like an endless flow of these come in and then promise that you could do everything, and you try them and it doesn't really work, right? So I think there's a reason there's a skepticism there, but I also think people are not quite understanding that we are actually seeing something new now. There is a new generation coming in, and it is different.
Right.
I do also think that there's a little bit of a flip side to that, which is that when you're seeing a lot of these platforms, like there's a tendency to oversell just a tad. I think there are
Yes.
we all know that there's a different level of complexity that's capable in different platforms.
Sure.
And there's a lot of them that has like build anything in 5 minutes. And you go, well, yeah, you can't build anything in 5 minutes. You can build some things in 5 minutes, right?
Yeah.
And there's also a lot of them that's saying, look, we can scale, and then show examples of how many applications they've made. And like, yeah, but when we talk about scale from an engineering background, we talk about a lot of different things. We talk about how many users. Yeah, sure, that's one thing. How about the complexity of the application? How many interconnected parts does it have? That's another degree of scale. And how big of a team can work on it at the same time? That's a third degree of scale, right?
Yeah.
And all these things fit in. And I think we're still in the place where there's been a lot of promises, and I don't know that we've entirely delivered on all of those yet. So
It makes sense.
it's not just blindness from the engineering side. There's definitely some prejudice that's sort of been built up over a few decades. But I also think there are real problems with no-code platforms that hasn't really been solved yet, or at least not been proven to be solved yet.
Yeah.
Sure.
And there's a little naivete on our side as the no-coder going, I don't really know what you do as an engineer, but I'm pretty sure I can do it as no-code.
Yeah.
Right?
We
Like,
got
I don't
that.
really know what happens on the other side.
I would also say that like the devil's advocate there is like the examples, the successful examples of no code businesses that have grown and scaled. We don't have a unicorn yet. We don't have those yet. Like it's still such a new technology that those successful examples are limited. And so like the first thing is say, all right, show me one then, right? And it kind of is hard to show them that, right? Like no matter what platform it is, some of the biggest successful companies don't actually want to say that they're built with no code. So they don't actually say anything about it. And it limits the amount of successful, use cases that we can return to them with and say, hey, here you go.
Yeah, for sure. But I think, and I mean, that's a big part of it, that time is one, right? Like we're seeing no code is not that old yet, at least the latest generation of it, right?
Yeah.
So, and it takes time to build these large projects, right? Like if you want to show a unicorn, well, you need a company to be a unicorn. They're
Yeah.
not going to halfway through their growth journey go, oh, guess we're throwing away our 6 years of code to try out a new platform.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you want a unicorn company built on no code, you gotta, it takes 10 years, right? Well,
Yeah.
like in most cases. So we're not going to see them quite yet.
Well said.
Mhm.
I do also think, like, as you said, there's a little naivety. I think I'm happy to go a bit further and say on both sides of this straight up arrogance, right? Like
Yeah.
there's a,
100%.
and I don't even mean that in a negative way, because I think if you look at general development and how technologies change, every new generation, I'm part of the generation that sort of early when we started working picked up Node, which was quite a radical new idea to how to build web servers. Like, there are no true new ideas. There's always someone in the 70s that came up with the idea, but it had been regarded like that's literally always the case. If you look into this, always in the 60s and 70s, like there was so much innovation that it seems like every idea anybody ever had was invented there, and then we just discovered it 50 years later.
Mhm.
But we were always criticized from like being radical and not listening to the Java developers or the .NET or C++ developers before, and we were doing things all the wrong way. And half the time we were doing really silly things, problems people already solved, and sometimes the sort of slight arrogance of just doing it our own way actually was generally inventive. And I think we're seeing that in no code as well. We're going like, as an engineer, I look at them and go, well, that's not how you do it. And you go, but actually it worked pretty well. Like, so maybe that's not a terrible idea, right? So I think you got to strike that balance of don't assume that the engineers don't know what they're doing, because they've been doing it for 50 odd years, right? At least there's a community more, right? But also it's okay to try new things that are completely different. Maybe it doesn't always work, but that's generally where innovation happens, right?
Yeah.
I do think we're going to see merging of the two. I think right now it's fractured, and I think like there's not that much overlap. And I think we're going to start seeing this becoming more of a mainstream thing.
Yeah.
I really hope so, because I think the only really two options is that either this generation of no code dies or the two merges. And I really hope it's not the first one. I don't think it's going to be, but I do think that those are two worlds that's going to meet, and we're going to start seeing like a lot of traditional coders move into no code, but we're also going to see a lot of no code platforms going through some serious changes to be able to really cope with the demands of more established engineering organizations, right?
Yeah, and just maybe allow code whenever possible in the no-code platform. So, like, if you are working with a developer, they can just open it up and just code whatever might be missing, kind of thing.
I think that's already possible in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
And I think that that's definitely going to be one of the strategies.
Yeah.
We in Toddle quite deliberately didn't go for that one, because while it is possible to add your own code, we kind of have a little bit of a different philosophy about it. So it's not like we actually put a little bit of a step in between you adding custom code, which is you can build in Toddle. We have actions, which is like if you're doing a big like workflow, which is, I think most of your users are familiar with Bubble, quite similar to how Bubble workflows work. You have different steps, and you can very easily just in your project go and create a new custom step that's built entirely with code, right? We have a lot of built-in you can use, but you can also just go and code your own. And then once you've done that once, you've now effectively extended Toddle's functionality, and you can reuse that as many times as you want.
Mm-hmm.
But you're not going to do that. Yeah. So it gives you basically full flexibility. There's really not a lot of things that's not possible when you can start extending the platform, right?
Yeah.
But you do have to do that step. You can't just go and say, right here, when I click this button, run this code. You have to go and create this action before. And it's sort of similar to how most programming languages work. When they come out, they generally don't support everything you need to do. Like I used Node as an example. When that came out, like there wasn't a library for connecting to MySQL or a database.
Mm-hmm.
Like nobody written that in JavaScript yet. And it actually took several years before someone did. So what they did is just created what's called a binding to a C library that did that. So basically just you call these functions in JavaScript, and what it actually does is it spins up some C code and executes that. And it's the same mentality we have in Toddle, saying we don't support everything yet, But as you run into problems, we, and as well as the community, are going to start saying, well, now I need to be able to access the accelerometer on a phone, which is not something we've built in yet. So I'm
Yeah.
going to go and build an action for doing that. And then when I've done that, I can now use that. Like now Toddle has that capability. And we're soon launching our package system, where that means that once you've done that, you can then upload that and share it with everyone. And
Mhm.
people can just go and say, I want to install that. So now Toddle can
Yeah.
access the accelerometer,
Community
right?
built,
Is that
expand that
something?
ecosystem.
Is that something
For
you
sure.
can monetize? Can the creators build these packages and license them or sell them, or is this a little bit more goodwill?
So we quite deliberately chose not to allow any monetization right now.
hmm
And the basic reason is that I think we've seen a few places, especially in the sort of more template land,
hmm
that it sort
Yeah.
of became the dominant. Like you had templates, but if you wanted something good, they were paid.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of good reasons to do that. You can have a good community building these paid template, but I also think it can sort of cannibalize your sort of package growth a little bit. Like if everything is I need to go and buy it, you're sort of like your
People don't
platform
add
is
them as
not
much.
developing. And we're kind of seeing this from the code world, right? Like the fact that you can just install libraries that someone made just to share with people, right? That
hmm
is why, like, there's no projects in the world in code ever built without at least probably 50% open source software, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So we need to build a community. We start with the default is I'm going to share this because I want to help everyone and they want to help me, right?
Mhm.
We know how we're going to make money. We're going to sell our projects to customers, and we're going to go and build applications that have users. And I
hmm
mean, those are great business models. And we might also sell templates. And I think that we'll figure out ways people can do that, probably initially off our platform. But I think there are still good ways of monetize. There's plenty of ways to monetize your business, right? But I think that community idea of let's build something and share it together, and let's that be the default at least.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the things, looking back early days of at least my bubble journey, the reason why I was able to get so far and stick with it was because of the free forum, right? Everyone was helping everyone for free for the good of the community. And I think that is a much more sustainable pattern than just building plugins. And, like in the bubble world, there are some plugin developers that exist. Some have stopped supporting their plugins. So now you have like broken plugins. Sometimes you have people that, just really charge a lot of money for their plugins. Some are really cheap. You don't really know what's good. You're hesitant to try, implement anything and pay for stuff. And so you slow down your own development when you could have just added that feature and just moved on. You're now like, okay, well, let me go hire a freelancer to build this, or, you know, bang my head against the wall for the next week trying to do this thing a different way. It would have been nicer just to have all these free tools.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's pros and
And I think
cons.
yeah, there are definitely some real cons, but I think
Yeah.
one of the things you mentioned there is like if I'm building a paid plugin, I might start doing other things. I might start a company and not really have that much time to maintain it anymore, right? And it
Yeah.
might just be sitting there ticking along. That's great. But for the community, it's much better if there's an active maintainer.
Yeah.
So when it's free, and at least in Toddle world, right? Like you can go any public package or any public project in Toddle. So whenever you're on our free plan, everything is
Mhm.
public. You can see what people are building. You can clone it, right?
Right.
And that's the same here. So if a package is not being maintained, you can write the author and say, hey, can I take over? Right. This is what we're seeing in the code world as well.
Yeah.
Or you can make your own clone of it. And like that's
Yeah.
within the license. Say, I'm gonna make my version of this one, and then I'm gonna start maintaining that.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the collaboration that really gets you somewhere. Like that is why we see a lot of incredible like software that's built this way, right?
Yeah. Let's talk quickly about Noodle. Today is their first day where they went open source. It's another, I think, a competitor of yours where they're a front end no code platform. What are your thoughts on them going open source? And yeah, what do you think there?
I haven't been keeping up with the latest news too much on them, but I
Sure.
think generally it sounds like a really good idea from what I can hear.
Yeah.
And I kind of get why they would move that way.
What would that
I
be? What are
don't know
some of
too
the
much.
advantages?
Well, I think the biggest, and we've had a lot of conversations about to what degree Toddle should be open source and which part should be. And I
Sure.
think at this point we're sure that we are open sourcing more of it, but we haven't quite landed on a decision on which exact part should be open source and which should be not be, right?
Yeah.
But I think there's one of the things we actually end up running into quite a lot is a sort of fear people have around platform login, which is a perfectly reasonable thing, right? And I've dealt with that my whole career. We
As a
decided
software
on not.
developer, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
so
there's a
it's not
platform
new to
login
NoCode in
everywhere.
any way. It's just a
No,
thing.
yeah, no, and I think what people we heard a lot of, you mentioned code export, right? And I think this is sort of a little bit of a trend in how to deal with vendor login,
Sure.
or you'll just export your code.
Yeah.
And I've been part of at least 5 major software rewrites, and
Mhm.
by major I mean where the teams were 10 to 20 people, and nobody likes it.
Yeah.
It's a major pain. It's an enormous expense. So the idea that you're just, and that is going from one somewhat popular framework often to another, or one slightly outdated but still well-known framework to another, right? Where all the code is written specifically so that people can read it. The idea that at any scale you're going to export code from a no-code tool, and then it happened to be in a format, framework, and style that the developers actually want to and are able to work with. I mean, that's a lot to ask, and I don't think any platform is capable of that today that I know of. And I'm not even
I don't
100%
think
sure
there
what
is.
your strategy would be for that. It would work for a smaller project, but as it scales, like being dumped a massive code base of a few 100,000 lines and then saying, hey, please continue working on this. It's a really good way not to keep your employees. Like that,
Yeah.
it's a hard one to hire coders for, right?
Yeah.
So I don't think I don't think exporting code is a safeguard against vendor login. But I think what Noodle is doing is saying, well, I'm 100% speculating. I think it's a way for them to sort of calm down a lot of companies and saying, you can always run this yourself because it's open source.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's speculation, I assume, because that's the most common reason why people would open source, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so it's
Either
almost like
yeah.
to counteract the lock-in, fear that everyone has right now. It's like, okay, well, you can export code, you can go open source, or you can just accept it for what it is, kind of thing.
Yeah. And I think, as you mentioned, it's not a new thing. It really isn't. The last job I had, we wrote everything in open source software. Like everything was coded, everything was written in open source software. Almost none of it was that specifically built for a platform. We
Yeah.
hosted all our code on AWS, and we were sort of looking and planning a project to move to Google Cloud, which should on paper be like a drag and drop kind of like you run your services here, spin them
Send
up
this
over
IP
there.
address to that one.
Yeah, go over there. Yeah, and our early estimates was 3 years.
Yeah.
Because
Wow.
nothing is that simple when you have systems of that size, right? Like that
That
never
are
happens.
actively
Like
running.
there's
and
always
need
like,
help.
okay, but then we have this auto scaling logic and that's custom. Okay, so we need to move that over. So even though all our applications were written in code that could be run anywhere, well, then they were using file storage on AWS, and that's different than Google Cloud file storage. And they were using these services, and that had to be migrated. And do we migrate the whole thing in one go? Which I think historically has almost never worked.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to do it gradually, and then there's all the in-between solutions. So platform login is universal and always happens. There are degrees for sure, and I think no code very clearly is like a little bit more than others, right? Like there are platforms where there's basically, if you want to migrate off that, well, you can.
Yep.
So there's that level of login. The way we do it at Toddle, the way we sort of suggest is saying, well, you can export individual components built in Toddle and embed them into other sites. So let's say you wanted to move off your Toddle application, you can kind of start a new project and one component at a time start moving them over, right?
Yeah.
So you do have that, or maybe you'll probably start moving most of them over and then replacing one at a time, right?
Yeah.
So there is a path to do that, but we're not pretending it's easy because it's never easy, right?
Yeah,
I
and it's
like
not
that.
easy.
Yeah.
That if you were to make it easy, that would be its own feature set that you would have to build for, which is
And it would
not
take a
really
long time.
the purpose of building a no-code platform, to make it easy to switch
Yeah,
off of no-code.
and it would be easy for like a couple of customers, right?
Right.
Like we can say, look, we've made sure you can export it to React. And now you have a React code base. And then
Right.
I, as a React developer, say, well, that's not how I like writing React. I think you should have used this thing. So now
Right.
we need to migrate it off like Next.js onto a different meta framework. And then
Yeah.
the next, at the time people would do this, like if we're 5-10 years into the future, they would almost certainly say, well, who uses React these days, right?
Hmm.
Obviously, this should be migrated into the framework of today. So
Yeah.
I don't think there is a winning strategy in code export. I think it's a little bit of a patchwork solution. To be fair, there are platforms that do that today. They generally don't do it because you can then just keep working on it. I think they're doing it because you can host externally. And that is a
Right.
perfectly reasonable
Right.
reason to export code. Like that is a solid
Mhm.
reason to do it. It's just, I don't think doing it with the expectations that you can just pick that up and start coding. I think that's probably
Yeah.
quite neat.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
although
fair.
I would say, I think, many of the platforms that get, accused of not being exportable, or you get locked in, do have like, I think you guys do this too, have some self-hosting functionality. If you wanted to have a dedicated server, I'm talking about Bubble here. If you wanted a dedicated server with a specific size and a specific location with specific database access, you could pay for it. You're not paying $30 a month for it, but you could run it on your own instance, kind of separated from the main, rolling updates they do, right? There's a lot more that goes into it. It's a lot more DevOps oriented. You start leaning further away out of no code and into the hybrid world of code and no code. But there are ways to kind of just do some export, right? You're using it yourself on your server. But yeah, I agree with you overall.
So what we do in Toddle is to say like if we're exporting and you're embedding a component build in Toddle somewhere else, you can host the code for that separately. Like you can just download the code to your own server and serve that up instead. For whole Toddle apps, you can't host it self, at least at the moment. But we also kind of have the benefit here because we're only front end. We're not running into different kind of extra critical legislations. Like we're not hosting your data. So
Yeah.
you don't need to worry about where they're hosting it, who has access. Like every time you have extra special requirements, that's not really a problem with us because that's not the part of your infrastructure we take care of, right?
Right.
Gotcha.
Right.
Yeah.
Cool.
Where do you think Toddle's going to be in the next couple of years, 2 to 3 years? Where do you see Toddle?
So our goal has kind of always been to empower software development teams to ship better and faster. And I think right now we're seeing a lot of individual people building their own business on Toddle, and that will always be a big part of it. But we're also starting to see startups with like more people starting to build projects in Toddle. We are seeing agencies and also a little bit like multi-people agencies, not one-man shops, all of them, right? Starting to get contracts, pick up contracts and build on Toddle. And we want to sort of help them grow and get more people in, because the more people you are building on Toddle, almost the more value it gives. Like the fact that your designer and your developer can work in parallel instead of one feeding designs into the other basically means like right there you're getting like
Value.
100% speed increase, right?
Yeah.
And then on top of that, the platform also makes you a lot more productive.
Yeah.
So definitely keep empowering people to build more and more complex things. We have a few like features we really want to support that we don't support so well yet. Like you can basically do anything because you're capable of extending the platform, right? And you don't really need special plugin API. It's mostly just like, I want Toddle to run this function, and it's relatively simple to do. But there's a lot of things where we're going like, but it would be nice if these things were built in and would be easier to access, right? Like there's a lot of at least the focus for the next year is going to be, we have all these capabilities. Like you can do whatever it is you want to do, But there's a lot of places where can we make that nicer? Can we make that simple?
Gotcha.
As we're getting into bigger teams, also investing a lot in our collaboration features. So we've basically taken Git from the code world, which is like a source code version control system that lets people work on their own individual versions and then merge only their changes together in the end, right? So we made our whole own version of that running behind Toddle, because we knew from the start that if you want something that scales, like, you need to be able to build it multiple people, and you have to
Yeah.
be able to do that without stepping on each other's toes, right? You
Yep.
don't have to wait for anyone, and you're not never going to break their stuff when you publish your changes, right? And so we built that in from the start, and we've got like a really good introductory sort of UI for that. But there's a lot of things that we've actually already supporting in our backend and our data model that we haven't really built all the nice bells and whistles for. Like, you can undo back to like the beginning of your project. You can roll back every single commit if you want. Like, if we store every snapshot version you've ever done on Toddle.
Impressive.
And if you want to, you can go all the way back, right?
Just
Whenever you're
delete,
working on a branch,
basically.
which is what we call versions.
Yeah.
Like, every 10 seconds, it bundles up an automatic commit. So right now you can do undo, redo in Toddle, but we want to add in that, like, you should be able to do that like in 10-second increments way back to you made that branch, right? You can and go and sort of all these things that people in the code world knows, like, yeah, I can do that with Git, right? Every time and I can pick the files I want to roll back and not all of them and all these things. So there are a lot of things there we want to add on. And we also actually have live collaboration today. Like, multiple people can work in the same branch and they get synced automatically. But the UI doesn't really, like, we haven't really invested in actually making that nice yet. We just didn't done the base work and saying we need to focus on the key part of that, right? So a lot of developer experience upgrades, a lot of like nice features that just makes your day-to-day a lot easier, and also makes you a lot more productive, right?
I love it.
That's good to hear.
Yeah, I really appreciate your
Screamed for that for a
viewpoint.
long time.
We haven't had someone on the podcast, a 20-year software engineer building a no-code tool and getting that viewpoint. So it's a totally fresh perspective, a lot to say, and I really like it, especially the stuff about lock-in and whatnot. Like, it's a hard thing, and it's not just the no-code industry; it's all industries. So thank you for taking the time to share all of that with us today.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this is great. Very enlightening.
Yeah, for sure. We'll make sure that we put information about how people can get started with Toddle in the description below. Otherwise, we'll also put your handles there as well. Andreas, thank you again for coming on to the podcast, and we really appreciate you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's been fun.
Well, a huge thanks to Andreas for coming on the podcast. It was a really refreshing episode to hear someone with that level of expertise in the software industry. 20 years going through all these problems, experiencing lock-in with AWS and a lot of different things in other ways, right? Come and build his own no-code platform. Still early on, but still very promising. And just the thoughts around that, the experience around that, really enjoyed it. What did you think, David?
I love the perspective. I have had and said a lot of the same things that he said about lock-in, about building, about code, about, where things will end up. So we see things very similarly. Which is nice to see because, I'm just some guy sitting in a chair, and he's got the experience building stuff. It will be cool. I think, you hear about all the things they've built into the data model, they've built into the infrastructure that they just haven't released yet. Is really nice to hear that they've like given it a lot of thought already, and that he's pulling his whole set of experience to build the tool for developers instead of building a tool for people who can't code. I think that'll be good. He's got a lot of competition, and I feel bad. I don't feel bad. There are lots of platforms out there now, and more will come. And I think, lots of developers, and so maybe this is good or not. Lots of developers have the same feeling that he has. I'm tired of rebuilding the same thing. I want the Figma to be the same. I want to use this interface to build. And so, who knows? I wish him all the best. I think it's a great platform. I think it's off to a good start.
Yeah, Emmanuel actually had a really refreshing take on competition, and he also doesn't believe that other no-code tools are competition. He believes software developer in the ad industry is the competition, and how big that is. And there's a huge amount there, right? And so if you can get software developers to start using these no-code tools, there's plenty for everyone to go around, kind of thing, right? And so, yeah, there are a lot of no-code front ends popping up now, but still, especially this one that's building for software developers, like that's a huge market. And so there's plenty to go around there.
Yeah, definitely. I think they'll find their space, and stick around. He did mention, I think some competition. I would be curious to see what I've said this now a couple times. I think I'm curious to see what Figma does. I think Figma is going to come up with a no-code builder. That would be interesting.
They got a lot of money in their pocket after that, and they're well poised. That would be really interesting. But you're just going to have to keep on listening to This Week in No Code and find out more.
Yeah.
Next week in No Code, right, David?
See you next week in No Code.
All right, guys. See you later.